This is Nicole Newell. She is our Sustainable Landscaping Program Manager.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. Hello, everyone. Man, I love plant people. Thank you all for taking the time to out of your life to join us for this live talk with John Valenzuela and the virtual tour of one of the food forest gardens in Benicia. And typically we have a live tour of the demonstration food forest gardens in Benicia and Vallejo. So this is our annual tour, and my heart is so heavy that we can't have it live and seeing all the magic that happens in these gardens. But I get to still see some of your beautiful faces on this virtual experience. And I'm so thankful for all the creative people that I work with that instantly got into solution mode to find a way to make a virtual tour possible. Allison's worn so many hats. Gabriella's helping us with putting it live on Facebook. Dave, our videographer, made this awesome video. And of course, John for reinventing and coming down and doing the live tour. And then just our whole organization. There's so much behind the scenes that happens. And so today, John Valenzuela will present a talk on permaculture. Then together we'll watch the pre-recorded tour of Living and Learning Food Forest. After we watch the tour, we'll have a Q&A with John. And I will close with a special offer from a local nursery. So the first time I met John was during my PDC, my permaculture design certificate with Toby Hemingway. He passed on, but he's the author of Gaia's Garden, which is an awesome resource if you're learning about permaculture. And he taught the Food Forest Plant Weekend, and you put this man in a garden and he comes alive. And so we're so lucky to have him. John Valenzuela is a horticulturist, a consultant and educator, first introduced to the sustainable design theories and methods of permaculture in 1989. John studied, practiced, and taught permaculture in Hawaii, Washington, Costa Rica, and throughout California. His special interests are rare fruit, home gardening, trees, traditional agriculture, plant propagation, and ethnobotany. So thank you for being here, John. Let's all send good vibes and a warm welcome to John.
Thank you, Nicole. It's lovely to be here with you all in the virtual world as best we can, sheltering in place from all of our homes and safe places. I hope everyone's healthy and happy as we can be in this unusual time we find ourselves in. And I feel for you if you're suffering from this situation. I know there's been a lot of not only illness, but loss of livelihoods and all these things and hardship. So I really feel you. And I just want to get you guys out in the garden so we can take care of ourselves and each other in the best way we can, in spite of all these difficulties we're having. So I want to thank Sustainable Solano. What a great organization. Many years ago, Carolina invited me in. I've got to know Nicole and Allison and working with David on this video. Thanks so much for inviting me and creating the space for this to happen, both this little presentation I'm going to do now. Well, not so little, we're going to spend about an hour talking about permaculture and food forests. So I'm excited about that. But what's even more exciting, I think, is this little video that we've put together of a walkthrough in this beautiful, home front yard conversion, the living and learning garden there that we visited in Benicia. So I'm excited about showing you that. And then, like was said, we'll have a little question and answer session, some resources at the end. So if you can stick it out to the end, I have a little 5 things that you can do to get started right now, even if you're not involved in the Sustainable Solano backyard conversion projects. I want to give you 5 things at the end of this whole presentations here that you can get started no matter where you're at, no matter how advanced you are or beginning. Hopefully there'll be some little goodies at the end for you is what I'm saying. So unless there's anything else, I think I should jump into my little presentation here. I see a lot of friends from other courses and other places. So good to see you all again, and a lot of new people. So welcome all. And Yes, I'm here, just so you know, I'm here in Sebastopol. So, you know, the apple trees are flowering and it's a nice warm day out here. And so that's where I'm coming from today, Sebastopol in Sonoma County. And let's see here if we can get started on a little presentation about permaculture and food forest. Let's see here. I think I can do this little screen share with y'all. Let's go. So this is my thing. I do this for a living. I do it for passion. I love plants, but I hope to spread out permaculture a little bit more for you beyond just plants at the beginning here, but we'll dive right into food forest stuff throughout. And it will be species heavy. Yes, I'm into plants, so we'll be talking about a lot of plants, but I want to lead us into some themes and things that'll be shown in our little garden tour that we'll have later. This is how you can get a hold of me, through my cornucopiafoodforest.com website. And please drop me a line, be persistent. I'm real busy and you know, ADD. So, you know, I got a lot of stuff going on. So just be consistent with me, persistent with me, and I'll get back to you. I'd love to hear your stories of what you're up to, or if you got any questions for me, let me know. So this is what we'll do in the next hour or so here. I want to take you through some history of permaculture and food forest. I'm into the history to kind of set the context for what we're doing here. So when you're doing it, you can think about all the people and places that are behind you, or, you know, that have led us to this place we're at. I want to talk about some examples, both here in California and other parts of the world, some parallel climates, you might say, some exotic tropical places too. And there's three themes I want to go with you guys, and that's water and fertility, soil fertility, and habitat. A lot of what we're doing with the Sustainable Solano demonstration food forest is water conservation and recycling water stuff. And the soil is a big part of that too. And then the habitat is all these complex relationships we create with these gardens. I will definitely get into the plants, the multifunction plants. You know, we'll talk about a bunch of species. And then we'll wrap up with some resources and what things I would like you to think about doing or looking into to carry on from there. So here we go. A little bit of history about some of the characters that have inspired permaculture or led permaculture. We have Bill Mollison and David Holmgren down in the left-hand corner there. Two Aussie characters, two gentlemen from Australia who back in the 70s were looking at the environmental situation, and instead of protesting, they wanted to come up with some solutions. So they came across a way of looking at agriculture as more of a no-till kind of perennial, woody perennial system. But permaculture has expanded beyond just the kind of ecosystem management stuff with the people care aspect that I want to talk about too. Some other folks that have especially kind of inspired and informed the permaculture way of looking at things that permaculture embraced as sources of information and inspiration for food forest and woody perennial agriculture. F.H. King wrote a book back in the late 1800s, turn of the last century, Farmers of 40 Centuries, talking about the traditional agricultural practices of the Chinese, which is a huge area of the world and lots of different cultures in China. So he talked about several different ways that the Chinese were farming sustainably for 4,000 years. Another interesting person that you might like to read their books, this book, Tree Crops of Perennial Agriculture, was written by J. Russell Smith back in the 30s. And I'll talk more about that book, but it was a book talking about tree crops as an alternative to tillage agriculture, that even back in the 30s, this was even before the Dust Bowl era, that they were seeing the problems with modern tillage agriculture and what it was doing to the heartland of the US. Up in the upper right-hand corner, we have Masunobu Fukuoka, who was the first person who Bill Mollison recognized as talking about a no-till grain agriculture. So he worked in Japan with overseeding different grain crops into standing crops, so that it eliminated the need to till, and he ran little duckies through there and stuff. And he has his books, like The Natural Way of Farming and The One Straw Revolution, are half philosophy and half agriculture, and they're really wonderful, inspiring books. There on the right-hand side, we have Mr. P.A. Yeomans and his Water for Every Farm, and the Keyline method is his way in Australia of taking an arid landscape and figuring out how to contour the land to shape it to infiltrate and absorb and embrace the water that normally would run away. And so his Keyline method is inspired some of the techniques that we're using in these backyard demonstration gardens with the swales that are contour level ditches, basically, that catch water and build up soil. So we use his methods. And then there were many women in permaculture. One of my favorites from the past that inspired permaculture is Ruth Stout. And she has some wonderful books that are hilarious and inspiring, relating to mulch gardening and no-till gardening. And she wrote a few books like How to Have a Green Thumb Without an Aching Back, a new method of mulch gardening. So there she is, reclining in her straw bales there, that's her gardening style. So anyway, I just wanted to lay out a few characters there for us as we get into this. A little discussion on permaculture principles and ethics, kind of are the core of what permaculture is. Permaculture being a contraction of permanent and agriculture, having in the last decades really expanded into a permanent culture. And so at the core of it are these three ethics of the care of earth, care of people, and the sharing of the surpluses towards those ends. That is the core, informs all of our decision-making process. And permaculture is really about design. So the design is the creation, assembling things, grouping things together, helping things function as they would optimize their relationships. So we have about a dozen design principles. This is the David Holmgren Pathways to Sustainability. And that's a great book that kind of summarizes a lot of Bill Mollison's work. We'll look at more references later, but these 12 principles here are basic kind of common sense things that are just guideposts for us in thinking about how we want to arrange our landscapes and our design process. But they involve simple things like observing and interacting with our landscapes, catching and storing energy, obtaining a yield, basic strategies to get us on the path towards more sustainability and better relationships, because that's what really permaculture is about. I'll let you read through those, and these references, of course, you can find online. Produce no waste, design from patterns to detail. These are all strategies that we use in our design process, and these are available online. You can look for this stuff. And we also have courses. We have full 2-week-long permaculture design courses, or maybe over weekends, over months. And I think maybe in the future, Sustainable Solano will be hosting some of these courses, maybe in your area of Solano County also. But there are many courses and ways to connect with these principles and get into groups and use them together with other people. That's really what we like to teach, is how to work in teams for these projects. Also, just to understand that permaculture just isn't about what you see in the upper corner there of land and nature stewardship, but it is a whole flower made up of these different petals that our ethics and design principles move through. So it's not only just the land and nature stewardship, but it's natural building and energy and resource conservation. It's different kinds of tools and technology toward those ends. Coming around in a clockwise towards the education and culture. This is another important part of permaculture that we work with and design with, that everything we're doing should be about, preserving culture and sharing and teaching, each one teach one. And there, at the lower part there, the healing, health and spiritual well-being certainly is part of what we're designing for in permaculture. There's a whole aspect of permaculture too that it relates to finance and economics. This is really important. Just the same way we watch energy flows or water flowing through the landscape, we'll be watching the way money flows through the landscape. And the same kind of principles can be applied to finance. They're applied to ecology. So these are some of the things we work with in permaculture. And lastly, but maybe just not the last, but another petal that I'll mention here are things like land tenure and community governance, just how we make decisions together. What are the best ways to communicate with each other? All these things are part of a permaculture design process, because to design sustainable systems, we need every one of these petals in this little mandala, and our design and ethics spiral through all of them. So I just wanted to spread out permaculture beyond plants, because I'm going to be talking a lot about plants and soil and water and stuff today. But just to know that's just one important aspect, prime aspect of it, but all these other parts of permaculture are in play, and we'll mention them throughout. So if you've done any research into permaculture, I know some of you have taken full courses or many courses or very experienced. Maybe some of you are brand new to permaculture. So just to, if you went online and Googled permaculture books, this is what you'd pop up with. And there are some that I want to kind of point out to you. Some of the original ones down at the lower left-hand corner, there's the Permaculture 1 book you'll see, which was put out in the, mid to late 70s. Out of Australia. That was Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. There was the designer's manual, this black one. You'll see it 3 times there in a little diagonal from the upper left corner. The Permaculture Designer's Manual, I sometimes refer to it as the Bible. It's really thick and just so dense. It's sometimes I just open it up and stick my finger in it, and I can come up with a wonderful kind of divinatory epiphany there. It's just so full of good things. The introduction to permaculture, that's the third one across on the top there, that's in green, or in the middle in the black version. Introduction to permaculture is a really nice one that I recommend. Nicole already held up Gaia's Garden, which is our dear friend Toby Hemingway's book that really brought kind of permaculture literature to North America. It was the first really popular North American book on permaculture, and he's a wonderful writer. You'll enjoy that quite a bit. So there's all the other books that kind of relate to permaculture that don't say permaculture in them. From our friend Christopher Shine's Vegetable Grower's Guide to Permaculture. He's out of Oakland. Christopher Shine, Wild Heart Gardens. We've even got the Square Foot Gardening book. So permaculture borrows from a lot of different disciplines and attempts to integrate them all into a site-specific, appropriate application of all these ideas. So there's the Square Foot Gardening right next to the Edible Forest Gardening books, or Restoration Agriculture that we're talking about broad scale, 20, 30 acres. There's a lot of material coming out of England and English-speaking countries. There is some books in other languages, and certainly the introduction of permaculture has been translated into several languages. But also, just for you urban folks, this isn't just for rural or country or suburban folks, but in the left-hand corner down at the bottom, you'll see Toby Hemingway's Permaculture City book, which I also recommend, to really look at these relationships with people and buildings and cars and businesses and all these urban contexts. How do we apply the permaculture principles in an urban context? And urban centers are very rich exchanges of energy and culture and information, and really a great place to apply permaculture. So getting back around to our food forest theme, tree crops, this book was very seminal and a very important book in I think if you get a chance to find a copy of this, you can see all the different versions of it that have been printed and reprinted over the years. Originally out in about 33, I think, or 35 or so, just as the Dust Bowl was getting started. This book is about changing our agriculture from tillage of annuals into no-till tree crops. And the frontispiece of one of his editions, this 1953 edition, has this really interesting image here of the globe with this odd ring of 18 laps of a railroad train with all these, cars that represent train carloads of soil that are circling the earth 18 times. This is the amount of soil that is being lost every year in the United States through erosion from our tillage practices. Just in the United States, back in 1953, this is how much soil was being lost every year in the United States. And this kind of information inspired J. Russell Smith. You can see Emeritus Professor of Economic Geography at Columbia. Bill Mollison also was a biogeographer. Geography is a great science in that it looks at bigger picture relationships. And so J. Russell Smith came up with different tree crops for every climate in North America that he thought would be appropriate to feed animals, which is the main reason we're growing, most of our crops go to feed animals. So he was thinking about how can we feed animals with tree crops? So there were other people that were inspired by J. Russell Smith's work. I just want to mention a few that leads us to our food forest. I'm coming to food forest, I promise. But this gentleman, Toyohiko Kagawa in Japan, was a very interesting person that, inspired by J. Russell Smith, really promoted tree agriculture to the farmers in Japan. And he was a really interesting pacifist and a really interesting cultural leader in Japan back in the 30s and 40s and into the 60s, actually. And he was a Christian social worker. He worked with the unions. Really interesting man. He inspired this guy, J. Sholto Douglas, who's studied down here at the bottom, land rescue agriculture, a three-dimensional forestry, was inspired by both Mr. Kagawa and J. Russell Smith. And Douglas was studying the indigenous use of tree crops in South Africa. And he thought, how can we model a modern agriculture after these traditional practices? And on the right, we have Robert Hart. Robert Hart worked with Douglas in writing some books on this food forest concept. And he was living in England, and he passed away about, 10, 15 years ago now. And he tried to create a food forest, a three-dimensional agriculture, a tree-based agriculture in his little place in England. And so this is some of the history of it. In permaculture, we look at these relationships, and this is out of the Permaculture Designer's Manual. One of my favorite images, trees in a whole system. Why do we like trees? What's the big thing with trees? It's true, grasses are very important, especially in certain climates. In drier climates, prairies are very important. Every ecosystem is important, the marshlands. But trees in particular and woody perennials have a lot of characteristics that we need to consider and design with as a foundation for our taking care of ourselves and for all the ecosystem services they provide. So they create all this habitat, they have all this interaction, they're keystone species really. With a tree, you have the shelter, the shade it produces, the water it attracts. Trees literally attract water from the way that they take water from lower depths in the soil, they redistribute it in the top layer of soil there, they emit it through their leaves, they rehydrate the air around them, they cool the air, that condenses more rain. So they're actually attracting rain and fog and that drip fog of summer, the shade, the mulch, building soil, all the products that they share with others, including not only just their fruits and seeds like we enjoy, but literally the mulch on the ground, the root exudates, the nutrients and fluids that are emerged from the roots underground feeding the soil life are all part of this process. So here you can see that the trees are taking literally sunlight and carbon dioxide and converting those into stable sources of carbon, food for other things. And more recently, the research has been documenting things that we've suspected about the relationships with plants, any other plants, trees with trees, but also trees with soil, trees with insects. They could be eating them and even communicating, to repel insects that could be eating them, and even communicating to beneficial insects to attract them to help defend them. So these are all new relationships that are being discovered by modern research with new, techniques that we didn't have before. So we love trees. They're iconic, they're poetic, they're so functional. This is why we're working with them and why we're using them as the model, as a forest, as a model. So Robert Hart, in his study of tropical home gardens, came up with a way to look at them in what he called the three-dimensional agriculture of these layers, what he called a 7-level beneficial guild. So we have on the left a larger, or what we might call a canopy tree. We have a slightly smaller, a lower tree layer, and smaller than that even, maybe about waist size for us, up to our height, would be shrubs. And a softer layer would be our herbaceous plants, things that might die back, come back from the roots, that are softer and smaller in their size at a lower layer. We also have what's called the rhizosphere here, which is the root layer, number 5. And so that's not only bulbous roots that store water and maybe food that we'd like to eat, but also I want to include the rhizosphere as part of the mycelial or fungal network that really ties all the plants together. And the fruiting bodies of fungi are the mushrooms. We call them mushrooms. That's the fruiting body. But the main body of a fungus is this web, this network of mycelium underground connecting roots, helping decompose things in the case of saprophytic fungi. And then there's mycorrhizal fungi, whose role is to connect plants to other plants and other resources underground. So that's the rhizosphere layer that we're stacking all these different plants in. Number 6 is what I like to call the ground cover layer. And this is important in creating our food forest systems because we need to have an area that's accessible. If we had just trees and bushes all packed in there, we can't even get in there. It'll be difficult to find the fruit on the ground. So some areas we need to have a nice flat ground cover layer. And those could be herbs or, different creeping plants like strawberries and stuff. And then we have, lastly, this vertical layer again, looking at climbing plants, whether it's on a trellis, a wall, or even on a tree, actually climbing on a tree. We can use climbing plants as another layer. So let's look at some of these. Originally, the food forests were inspired by tropical food forest, home gardens, and three-dimensional agriculture, these woody perennial systems in certainly Central America, Indonesia, and in parts of Africa also, where it's got an abundance of rainfall, abundance of sunlight, and plenty of fertility. Maybe animals were involved, or they were near homes where the surplus, the wastes, the so-called waste or excess nutrients were distributed nearby a home. So these systems were able to be stacked and packed in very dense plantings in the tropics. So in the tropics, because we're not limited by water, sun, or fertility in these situations, you can really pack the plants in. And in this artistic rendering, we see what is a Brazil nut forest in Brazil, in South America. And up until recently, Brazil nut trees were not known to be cultivated. They were only wild harvested. So what we're seeing here is a seasonal camp. You can see the people down below are harvesting the Brazil nuts as they drop from the trees. And in this thatched home there, they can see they have a seasonal residence, and then we'll have seasonal crops that will sustain them during this harvest period. They might spend a few weeks there, and then all the understory plantings there beneath there, the palms, the shrubs, all the medicinal plants they would need, all the spiritual and beautiful plants they would need are all planted in the understory there in a very dense stacked system. I got to travel around in parts of Mexico and Central America. I lived in Hawaii for 15 years. But one of my favorite food forests I've ever been to was in the southern part of Costa Rica in the Bribri Indian Preserve down there. There's the Quecoldi Reservation they have there. And we were touring around and doing a permaculture course there on a tour. And we were, our tour guide there, the man in the blue shirt, his name is Lucas, and we were walking by nearby a main site of theirs, and along the trail in the forest, I noticed all these food plants. There's a banana tree there above us. There's a cacao bush. There's vanilla orchid vines climbing up. There's some taro plants down there, and there was all these food plants I noticed in the forest that wasn't a properly tended garden or yard. And I said, Lucas, why are these food plants here? What is this area here? It seems to have all this food in it. And he said, oh yeah, this is just, you know, along the trail here in between our villages where Abuelita, Doña, I forgot her name, but this, grandma was planting in between the villages over decades. And over time, the plants became predominantly these food plants. And we were there looking at a new little planting they had on the ground there of some little medicinal herb that they had protected with a few little sticks so it could get established there. But this was an amazing food forest I saw created by indigenous people in Costa Rica some years ago. As I mentioned, I lived in Hawaii for 15 years, and I was really blessed to have Native Hawaiian folks who shared their wisdom with us Haole folks, with us newcomers. And it was so beautiful to see the renaissance in Hawaiian culture there after, just like in California, our genocide here with Native folks, a loss of people and land, and them coming back, their language, their medicines, their dance and traditions with their stories, but their agriculture too. And so here I am in an old traditional site in a taro patch, a lo'i, where they're growing this taro plant, a traditional food crop there, along with the breadfruit tree. So they had, again, their own Polynesian food forest, layered agriculture. And they brought with them about 24 plants in canoes from Tahiti, Kahiki. They brought canoe loads of plants to their new homes. This is what the Polynesians did. They went from island group to island group, bringing their food plants all the way from Southeast Asia, many of them. Don't get me started on the sweet potato, though. If you want to learn about, prehistory confluence of different cultures, talk to people about how sweet potatoes got to Hawaii, because they're from the Americas. So 24 canoe plants made it to Hawaii, and this layered of multi-purpose plants. I learned so much in Hawaii and inspired me so much. But where do we live? We live in these oaklands in what's now called California. One of the highest densities of native people were living here before the Europeans found this place. Very high densities of people around, especially the Bay Area, these inland seas, these estuaries that make up the Delta area into the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys we call now, up into the Sierras, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So many people lived here in California, and our agriculture, the prior original sustenance of this land were these oak trees. And even before people, you see the little native planter there up in the tree? Can you find the little bird in the tree there? Those are our native planters planting. In my nursery, there's so many oak trees that these that are being planted by these little birds, you know. So this tree, the oak tree, is the foundational sustenance for so many species, not just humans, but so many species of mammals and birds and insects here in California. So let's talk about some of our original California food forest plants. So the acorn, of course, from the oak tree, you know, we have a dozen kinds of oak trees easily here in California. And some of them, like the black oak or the tanbark oaks, were huge nuts and just some of the favorites of native folks. But they're all edible, just with a little bit of processing, leaching. But there's other native nuts too that we have. Large trees like the black walnut. We have one that's a little bit different down in Southern California, but black walnuts, you know, are well known in Northern California. We have our pine nuts in those hot areas of California, the gray pines, all kinds of pine nuts. Even down in Southern California, we have our Torrey pines, make a great nut to eat. Pine nuts, and then the bay nuts. Some people don't know that bay nuts are edible. You can eat the little fruit when it's ripe from around the seed. It looks like a little baby avocado. They're distantly related, but the seed itself is very aromatic, like the leaves. It's like, wow, you know, almost, you know, too much. So you have to roast them, and that drives off all those volatile oils, and then it becomes this almost like a chocolatey, coffee-like flavor. And I have friends making drinks and coffee out of chocolate and different drinks out of the bay nuts. So where all these wild foods are concerned, really learn how to identify them and make sure you're not eating some more poisonous imposter, or really understand how to process the fruits properly. Another very important part of traditional food plants here in California, in our layered system, getting down into the earth, or what we call geophytes in a scientific term, meaning you know, a root crop basically. And a couple that I'll mention, the blue dicks that are just about coming into bloom now, that have these beautiful dark purple flowers and a little potato-like bulb at the base of them. And another one on the right there that's related to, as you can see, it's in that umbellifer Apiaceae family, like cilantro or celery or parsley, or carrots, is this little yampa, or peridia is the scientific name. And this is like a little maple syrup flavored carrot. Not that big, but these are some of the types of crops that were traditional. And then, of course, the mid-story, so many shrubs and berries and vines that would make up the mid-story that were important to native people. Many types of berries, the manzanita, the little apple. You know, you can make a cider out of that, just mix it with some water, make a sun tea out of that. Of course, the elderberries. We must always respect our elders. The elderberry is an amazing plant, medicinal plant. Don't eat the red ones. Those are poisonous, but these blue ones, or Mexicana or Cerulana, they're called, Sambucas, are fantastic. You can make a lot of good medicine, you know, good medicine for flus and with that plant. And then in the lower left-hand corner, the black currant, and then our native blackberries on the lower right-hand corner there. Berries are very important in the northern climate. Small fruit, ripens very easily. A lot of these plants can tolerate some shade, which is great when you have a really stacked garden and you're looking to, oh, I want to tuck one more plant in here or there, and it's, you know, got some shade. These berries can produce fruit in part shade, so that's a great thing to know about these. If you want to learn more about this, please look at this book. It's so inspirational. MCAT Anderson wrote this book about traditional uses of plants of the Miwok, of the Sierra Miwok, and this book, Tending the Wild, Native American Knowledge and the Management of California's Natural Resources, is so eye-opening. And I want to acknowledge the folks wherever you are living. Here we have Miwok folks in this area where I live in Sebastopol area, and also Pomo up towards the lakes. In every area there were traditional people. Get to know who those traditional people are, because they still are around and they need your support, and they have much wisdom we can learn from. So this is a really wonderful book about learning more about these things. And in this evolution, I'm going to talk about a little bit about this history, because things changed radically when the first Europeans showed up here, both from the Cabrillo original to when the Spanish actually established their mission systems in the late 1700s through the mid 1800s. This is in San Francisco there. So this is the first introduction of this kind of European, not even European, this was more kind of the Mediterranean culture, because really Spain was heavily influenced by the North Africans and the Middle Eastern people through the Moorish influence. And that's really what we see ending up in California. So with the missions and this natural building, here's a natural building that's been there almost 200 years, made of earth. This is what we study in permaculture, natural building materials. This is adobe. This has been there since the this is here from the early 1800s, so about 200 years now. So what they brought with them is not only this architecture of, allowing the sunlight to, kind of passive solar architecture and all this, but this paradise garden concept, taken right out of the Bible or the Old Testament, and other scriptures from the Middle East, is this paradise. It's a harsh world out there, and you make this beautiful garden of waters and fountains and fragrant plants, and these plants that we know from the Mediterranean, the figs, grapes, pomegranates, all these plants that do so well in California, because it had a parallel climate. So this is part of the culture that the Spanish brought with them, in addition to the slavery and, other, the genocide that happened later. Let's look at the plant things that they brought here. And there's a project down in Santa Barbara, which is about the last intact mission that the Catholic Church retained even after the dissolution of the mission system, is the old mission in Santa Barbara. And they have a project there. Professor Jerry Sortome has this old mission huerta project there that is interesting. They call it a living museum repository of heritage plants of the California mission era that was 1769 to 1834. So they include all the native plants, the uses of native people's plants, all these Spanish, European, Mediterranean plants that were brought, even some South American plants that were brought to California. Here you can see Three Sisters garden growing next to this Capuline cherry. The Three Sisters being the corn, beans, and squash, the traditional way that those three crops were grown in a stacked system, with the corn needing the most light, the beans using them as a climbing, vertically, the squash smothering weeds below, being a great light management system. Also great in the sense that the grain needs nitrogen that maybe the beans would be able to provide through their nitrogen fixation. And even a culinary guild. The corn, beans, and squash make up the succotash, which is a traditional kind of a mixture of the three that we know from the southeast of the US. But this is a Capuline cherry tree, a low chill cherry from the highlands of Mexico. And you can see underneath some of our little European greens taking advantage of the shade of that tree. So that's a great little example there at the Huerta project. Project that I'm involved in is a project of heritage trees up in the Sierra Nevada that were planted after the Gold Rush era. Gold Rush era is when the major group of white people came to California, displaced native people, a lot of immigration them, and they brought with them all their favorite plants. And one of them was this gentleman, Philippe Gillet, and he brought all these plants from France, and he was kind of the French connection back in that time. And this is right now up in the Sierras. This is amigo Bob Cantasano. He's 9th generation Californio. his ancestors were on the first ANZA mission here, and he's studying these old trees that they find up in the Sierras that are from this era of Philly-Gillet back in the 1880s. And I'm on the board of the Philly-Gillet Institute, and we are discovering these old trees up in the mountains and propagating them and telling the stories of the Gold Rush era tree crops that are still alive. And that's what's amazing, is that in our neighborhoods, in your neighborhood, I really encourage you to go out and find these heritage trees and really understand the stories and histories involved, and understand what a legacy these tree crops can be. Some of these trees are upwards of 150, almost 200 years old. And so when I'm planting a food forest garden, I'm thinking about that. What is, we're benefiting from harvest from trees that are this old, from people who are long gone. I'm thinking about how our descendants will benefit from trees hundreds of years from now. I live in Sebastopol, so of course we're really into this character, Luther Burbank, and he introduced so many varieties of fruit trees and other plants to the world. This is in the nearby here. We have the Gold Ridge Experimental Farm, just outside of Sebastopol here, where he did a lot of experimentation. He rode his bike from Santa Rosa over to Sebastopol here to do more gardening. He lived in Santa Rosa and had his home there, but he had a 17-acre experimental farm here. And there's a few acres of it left you can visit, including this amazing royal walnut that's a hybrid walnut that he bred. It was planted in 1885. Do that math. What is that? 135 years old? And it's still there producing nuts. So this is what surrounds us here in California. This is this is in the Gold Ridge experimental farm there. This is a multi-grafted chestnut tree in full blossom that he was doing all these experiments with, breeding and then grafting, which I'll talk about later. As a propagation technique, once you get a really good variety, you can propagate it through different methods, grafting being one. And I liked how it was paired up, just kind of them embracing each other with the native live oak, California live oak there to the right, embracing each other, these two wonderful nut, seed crops from trees. So the grafting is this thing where we can use a very strong rootstock. In this case, this is a black walnut rootstock. You can see the black bark there. As a native tree, has a really resistant and strong rootstock that on top is planted a European or Carpathian thin-shelled walnut that's easier for us to crack open and eat. Less flavor than a black walnut, but more commercially viable. And so most thin-shelled walnut orchards are planted on some type of black walnut or black walnut hybrid. And so you can see there the graft union is very clear between the different types of bark there. And so this is a propagation technique that most all fruit trees and nut trees use. So in understanding how these trees grow, I'm looking for wild examples and what, observe and interact. What are the wild plants telling us, these old plants and these wild plants? So I'm looking around here, and this is in Novato and Marin County, and I'm looking along the edge of this road here. On the left, there's a road, railroad tracks to the right. And along this road, maybe somebody was eating a peach, threw it out their car window. And right along the edge of the road there, where maybe that road had a little more runoff, right? The roadway shed a little bit more water and deposited it on the edge of the road there where that peach pit dropped. And here's this little peach tree that just grew up on its own. Nobody watered it. I don't think anybody intentionally planted it. I think it planted itself, found a little home, sprouted, and look at it. That's only about 5 years old, that little peach tree. And peach trees are one of the few trees that I would plant by seed. They're fairly true to seed. They're self-fertile. That means they pollinize themselves, and fairly true to seed, and a great plant to see how good the fruits will be, and certainly great rootstock. You could, just to go back, you can plant a lot of different things. You can graft a lot of different things onto a peach rootstock. You can graft peaches, nectarines, almonds, plums, apricots, and the hybrids like the pluots and apriums and all that stuff can all be grafted onto a peach rootstock. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Another great rootstock you should know that's a wild tree, probably in your area, very common in the Bay Area, is this cherry plum tree. The little fruits are sometimes pretty good, sweet, sometimes tart. They're different colors. There's red leaf ones that are where they're coming from. See in the distance there, in this photo, in the distance, there's that dark tree. That's a red leaf cherry plum that has escaped cultivation. The birds are spreading the seeds around, and it has reverted into different colors and diverged. And so this is just one that the birds planted, full of fruit, another great rootstock for grafting onto. Excuse me. Let's go forward. So here is one that I've just done that. So you'll see the plum tree, the cherry plum tree at the bottom has been really kind of mauled by the deer. This damage at the bottom is from browsing. They're nibbling on the leaves. And they're also raking. The young bucks have, when their antlers are growing, they have this fuzz on their antlers they got to rub off. So they like little 1-inch diameter trees that are kind of bendy that they can rub their antlers on. And that really wrecks the bark of the tree. So the tree is kind of trying to defend itself with a bunch of little spiny, sticky growth at the bottom. And it's all stunted down there. But at the top, right about shoulder height, is where I started grafting in something else just above the browse height. And in this case, I've grafted 3 or 4 apricot sticks, little scions of apricot on top of that tree. And if you look there, you can see the apricot fruits forming. I did this just the year prior. So I grafted this in March, and then the 1 year later in June, there were ripe apricots. Just 1 year later. So you have this established rootstock that you can use, and you can just graft onto it and things can grow. I'll get the right direction here sooner or later. Here I am up in Orcas Island. This is Douglas and Samuel Bullock, 2 of the 3 Bullock brothers, tending to a grafted, a wild pear tree that they've grafted. See below, it's all kind of eaten down, but in the middle there, you see those larger leaves? That's from a grafted, selected, large fruited pear variety. And the rest of that pear tree is thorny and has little gravelly, sandy fruits, but they grafted that wonderful cultivar, a desired fruiting variety on top, and now they'll have wonderful pears there. They never planted that tree. Birds planted that tree. They never watered that tree. That tree was happy on its own, and then we put a cultivar on it. Here is another example. This is a crabapple patch. Wherever you see crab apples, often in the Pacific Northwest, that's an area that the native folks, the native tribes were cultivating, and they ate the little crab apples. Us as modern white folks, we like the bigger apples, sweeter apples. And so we are top working or grafting onto these rootstocks. You can see how it's done. Just little sticks are slipped or just slid under the bark there and then wrapped up. And then we label them to make sure we remember which varieties we have. And then this becomes a productive hedge of a larger fruiting. Here is another example of the diversity of rootstocks. If you get the right rootstock, you can grow things in even a swamp. This is on the wetlands of Novato Creek. This gets 6 inches deep in the wintertime. This is the wintertime. I grafted this to 5 different varieties of plums. This is a wild cherry plum that I put on, prune plums and all these different things on there. This is adjacent. Right behind me here is a little a soccer court, a soccer field. And I'm hoping the kids will kick the ball out here in the summertime and bump into this plum tree that's full of plums, when they fetch their soccer ball. So let's look at some examples in some different climates. Let's go down to Baja California. And this is where we get a lot of our winter vegetables from. Our Del Cabo, the Del Cabo brand is the organic little cherry tomatoes that are brought up. This is the field out here on the right. You'll see is a typical kind of plowed. That's an organic field of cherry tomatoes that we get up here in California. Wonderful that it's organic. They're not using pesticides. But look at the farm in the foreground on the left. This is Gabriel Hauer's farm down there. And this is one that's based on trees and perennials. Let's take a closer look here. He's an amazing plant collector. Gabriel Hauer helped founded Seeds of Change. He's in the Secret Life of Plants book. He's just an amazing plant person. He's into biodiversity gardens. And here, for example, is a portion of his aloe collection. But the place there, he calls it Buena Fortuna, and it's a botanical garden. And you know, these kinds of vegetables you don't really see in the tropics that much. This is winter grown, shade grown annual vegetables that we're used to and accustomed to here. But I'll show you how he grows these. Here they're grown in the understory of a tropical forest, in this case papaya trees, which can live maybe 10, 20 years, but these trees are only about 3 or 4 years old at the most. Papayas start producing after 12 months if you have a frost-free climate. And you can see in the understory there in the wintertime, he is growing all these wonderful greens, enjoying that shade. But he's also growing lots of sun-loving things. So when we're doing a food forest, it's not just gardening in the shade. We're not gardening in a forest, we're gardening like a forest, especially using forest edges to where light penetrates. We're looking at the forest edge as the model. So we'll have darker areas and then we'll have bright sun areas. It's very patchy. You know, we're looking at a diversity of habitats. So of course, you have full sun-loving things like your amaranths and some of the sun-loving plants. And here's Gabriel there on the left with the mustache, and he's giving a tour to some of the folks of his place, some tourists visiting the area. And this is the cultural part of it, right? He's not only a plants person, but he understands that there's so many values that surround these plants. Let's look at some of them. Oops, excuse me. In Buena Fortuna, this botanical garden, the people living there have all these services that they're sharing with folks. So these gardens are much more than just, you know, the ecological functions and productivity of the plants. They are places where people can tour and learn, like we're going to tour this afternoon or today at the gardens. It's a plant nursery where they're making more plants. They're selling seeds. They're doing landscape designs. Hey, here's how we can make this kind of a place at where you live. They're also growing art materials and weaving materials and craft materials, like for basket making. And they're also doing education there. So every landscape can be designed and built and function in all these different ways, including all the petals of that permaculture flower that we talked about earlier. So looking at our climate, we have a unique climate here in California. It's Mediterranean. We're not tropical. We're not northern temperate. We're somewhere in between. So we share qualities of both of those tropical and northern climates here. So our unique ecosystem is called chaparral. The shrublands are unique to California in this area. And in the Mediterranean, the word that's used is the French word maquis. In South America, in Chile, we have a similar climate where they have the shrublands there are called the matorral. In South Africa, they call it the fynbos. And in Australia, it's the quangan. And so all these parts of the world have nearly identical climates to us in that they're near oceans, they're on west coasts, so it moderates the climate. They're between 30 and 40 degrees north and south. And so there's a lot of dry summer. Dry summer characterizes these climates and moist, mild winters. So these are our parallel climates. Here in California, some of my favorite food forests. This is one in Marin County called Robson Harrington Park in San Anselmo. It's a beautiful old Victorian with these layers to it. It has a overstory of native bay and live oak. Underneath, there's a fruit tree layer. And then the ground layer is a community garden. And so it has all the layers of a food forest. You may not think of it as such, but I really think it is. Here is the citrus trees. You can see the beautiful steps and access, which is really important for any landscape, is to include the aesthetics and the accessibility that invite people in. It's not just about the plants. I mean, it's a lot about the plants, but it should also be about that people care. So having it inviting and beautiful is part of it too. Here we have almost a friendly competition between the plants and the people's ceramic artwork there, who can be more beautiful. But this is a beautiful flowering pomegranate complementing this beautiful ceramic garden artwork. Another thing that's beautiful about that is this outdoor architecture where we're embracing living outside more, bringing plants indoors, but also bringing our living out into the garden. So these little outdoor kitchens and living spaces are wonderful. And this architecture can also be used to enhance microclimate for plants. And you can see here this ability to absorb sun and kind of protect from cold winds can be used to our advantage. Here's an example in the north of Italy, in the Cinque Terre area, which really reminds me of California to a degree in its climate. Here we have this structure of these rock walls protecting a little lemon grove. This is in the winter, and there is some frosty air that rolls down this mountain that this wall protects these plants against. You can see how it slopes up steeply. In the background there, you can see the olive trees. And then in the foreground, you can see a deciduous little grapevine there. But these walls here are protecting from the frosty air rolling down the mountain, but also absorbing that heat and reflecting light to help ripen those citrus trees in the middle of winter when those citrus trees are going to be harvested. So this is an example where the architecture can increase and improve the habitat, the microclimate for trees. Conversely, here at Village Homes, here's an example of the plants creating microclimate for the buildings. And so in this case, we have grapevines protecting the building from that very hot summer sun. But in the winter, it allows all that good winter light to come into the building to warm it inside. So a deciduous vine on the south side of the building is a great strategy to enhance your microclimate. And this is in Village Homes. This is one of Bill Mollison's favorite places to look at what suburbia could really look like if it was surrounded by water infiltration and food trees, you know. Another thing I'll mention is when we're doing these landscape conversions and getting rid of the wasteful lawns, I'm all for that. At the same time, a very small lawn or a little patch of a meadow, an herbal lay, is appropriate for people to enjoy themselves, to have a little picnic, to have space to be. So that may be appropriate. I love the use here of the recycled, what we call urbanite, which is recycled concrete. In this particular landscape of the Garden for the Environment, which is a great community garden in San Francisco. All these places I'm mentioning because I'd like you to go visit them and see how they might inspire your gardens. Here, let's get down to this idea of a guild. A guild is a combination of plants that are functioning in a way to complement each other, and they have benefits for us also. So in this case, we have a pear tree that's in the middle there. We also have a kind of protecting the ground and smothering weeds is this beautiful plant. It kind of looks like a comfrey plant, but it has these sunflowers on it. This is a plant called elecampane. And elecampane is a beautiful medicinal herb. It's really good for the lungs. It's a good one to learn about right now. It's also a big leafy plant that shades out and displaces a lot of weedy, especially grass that trees don't really like to compete with. And its sunflower-like blossoms have small little, smaller flowers in the center of it that are perfect size for beneficial insects like pest predators and parasites to feed on before they go attack the other pests in your garden. So great habitat plant. Additionally, you can't barely see it, but off to the left there is an Elaeagnus or an autumn olive or gumi plant that is in there. That's a little nitrogen fixing plant that I'll show you a picture of later. So we have a nitrogen fixing plant that's shrubby in the middle story. We have, which is a process I'll talk about a little bit more with the soil, but it actually captures nitrogen out of the air and makes it available for plants or for itself and makes it grow better. So it uses less nitrogen. But also those leaves of the elecampane you can cut, chop and drop for mulch. And we have the fruit tree at the basis of it. So we have food, medicine, we have the different layers, we have weed suppression, we have fertility. all this going on at once. And so this is a complementary little guild or grouping of plants. Good thing to know is most plants aren't antagonistic. They're beneficial to each other. And so, yeah, let's continue here and see if I can run through a few more, because we want to leave some time for the video and some other questions, of course. So here's my friend's food forest up in Orcas Island. The cherry tree, the understory of hardy ginger right under the tree, and a bunch of greens. Vines growing, that's a plum tree in the foreground, the vines growing up. Think about not only the 3 dimensions, but also the 4th dimension of time. Time being, the staging and planning of the succession. So here we have a succession of leeks in lettuce, and this can tell us this is the same process, of the lettuce comes out and the leeks continue to grow. Lettuce takes 60 days, leeks takes 120. Same in our food forest. Our fruit trees take a while to grow, so in between we can grow all kinds of different crops like corn, or in this case, we're growing strawberries and beautiful children. So let's looking at Nicole there, wondering, I should be wrapping up soon.
Yes, that'd be great. And so we have time for the video and then Q&A. And if we want to continue, if you have the energy, maybe we could do some more at the end.
Okay, sure. Let's run just through 5 more minutes, and we'll run through a few themes, and then we'll see if anybody wants to stick around later. So just a few themes. Water, we're going to talk about planting water. It's essential. If you don't have your water right, nothing works in your garden. This rainwater harvesting, Brad Lancaster is a great resource. Catching your roof catchment, we're talking about all that gutter water, putting it into tanks if you can figure out storage, but certainly infiltrating it and storing it in your soil is a fantastic strategy. Here you can see in village homes these swales, or areas where it can just percolate into the soil. We also work with this laundry to landscape strategy that we'll be seeing in the tour. Graywater Action is a great resource. We have a little diversion valve there next to the washing machine to where we can put it back into the sewage system if we need to. If we're using bleach or something we don't want to put on our plants, then we can turn the valve and put good water out into our little distribution system, and we'll talk about that in the tour. We integrate some animals, certainly when we can, like some duckies, but water can carry nutrients, and this is the whole hydroponic or aquaponics thing. This is my friend Max Myers using that water to, that nutrient-rich water to feed plants and actually grow plants, to clean the water. There's even surface weeds that we can grow on our ponds, like the duckweed, to feed soil. Couple comments on feeding the soil. This whole soil food web is what we'll be focusing on. How can we get more organic matter feeding the soil that feeds the bacteria and fungi that feeds all the other critters in this whole chain reaction of nutrient sharing? And this is the stable, natural way that nutrients are cycled in the system. When we till and we apply chemical fertilizer, we disrupt all those systems, and we actually make the soil less fertile. So this is what we're focused on, and I really want you to think about recycling your food waste into worm bins, at least as a start, or if you get more advanced and have more room, to try a 3-bin compost system. I really recommend these ways to recycle your food waste. Do not let that food waste get into the landfill. Put it back into your soil. And then, of course, we're importing wood chips and finished compost. That's great to kickstart something. And then we also apply our mulch, along the contour, in rings around the tree, not piling it up against the stem. But this is how we use these resources to kickstart things. And then we think about how we can sustain it with nitrogen fixing plants like these broad beans or bell beans, how we can use maybe animals for tillage, weed eating, and their manure. But there's a whole variety of nitrogen fixing trees like locust and mimosa. Here's that gumi bush with the beautiful little berries. And there's even weedy plants, native plants, like our cercis and our ceanothus. There's all these, lotus is another species of nitrogen fixing plants, along with lupins and the clovers. This is owl clover. These are all native plants that you can use to improve your soil, chop and drop. And these systems, we're looking at mowing things, harvesting them at the exact right time. This is Michael Phillips. He's into this whole mycelium mycorrhizal planet that Paul Stamets got kicked off some years ago. And this is this communication that's happening underground that I want to leave you with, and then we'll get to the tour. We're talking about the way plants communicate with each other through mycelia. It's fantastic. And if you speak Spanish, you can look this up on the Wood Wide Web. And so this is talking about the plants communicating, the plants signaling to beneficials, and it's just a wonderful, complex communication system we're just learning about. And with all this woody material too, we can grow shiitake mushrooms, we can pile up those logs, so we'll talk about a little hugu culture in the garden and the tour also. So I think on that, we should, we'll talk more about the habitat for predators and parasites and pollinators, maybe if we want later. I think we should get into that slide to the tour, and then we can continue on from there. So you can release me from my my screen sharing there, and I'll join you all. Thanks so much.
I had gotten my fava beans and I'd planted them in nice soil, but I'm also wondering, is a fava bean something that I can plant on my hillside in areas where I only have clay soil that's been untreated?
Well, great, yes. There's a few details to all these things, of course, and where I've seen fava beans used really well is literally planted in the drip line of a young fruit tree or so, and then, you know, which is only maybe 10 or 20 square feet, and then as they're flowering, that cut and drop down for mulch there around the tree. But you're asking first about something different, is can we put fava beans out into rougher areas? And so there's a distinction. There's fava beans, which have the big long pods that we eat the large seeds of. But there's something else that's very closely related called a bell bean. And those are typically much smaller, and therefore they're cheaper, or no, how could I say, more efficient. Like one small seed makes one big plant. And so they're used more often in cover cropping. So these smaller bell beans, they're called, are used more in rougher areas. They're often used in combination. Usually when we plant a cover crop, it's a few things. You can do just a monoculture, but we like to mix things up. So we'll have a vetch and a clover and a fava bean or a bell bean, along with maybe a rye or an oak grass to kind of stand up also and kind of give support for those things. So that's a typical kind of a cover crop mix that you'll find. And those can go into rough areas, but it's helpful if you give them, you know, a little bit of organic matter to get started. I'm not saying you have to double dig it and give it a bunch of compost, but a little bit of compost, maybe a little bit of calcium or something, depending on your basic soil. But I think that if you grow anything, even if it's just weeds, or your so-called, you know, plants that I really don't have any use for, that's a use for them, is just to keep cycling them. So I think fava beans might need more of a garden situation that's a little more cultivated. And the other thing about harvesting your cover crops, if you let a legume go to seed and you eat those seeds, that's more of where the nitrogen and the protein are going. If you really want to feed the soil, you'll cut that nitrogen fixing crop, that bean or pea or whatever it is, that bell bean, at flowering. If you cut it at flowering and lay it down, that's when you're going to have the most organic matter, and that'll feed the soil the most nutrients. So it's always a little juggling game. Great question. Thank you.
So I love there are a lot of questions going into the chat and a lot of answers as well. So this is great seeing the community, answering the community.
Excellent.
A reminder, please use that raise hand if you want to ask a question. But we do have a question about the best plants for a sloping, windy, west-facing yard. I think a lot of folks are wondering about their own yards as they're listening to you.
Yes, you know, like I was saying, this whole process, you know, it's very site specific. And so you're getting into some details here. So let me put it into some context that I think everybody could benefit from. When you're talking about a sloping site, there's a few things at hand. It may be hard to even access it or stand up because it's so steep. So creating access ways, small terraces could just be even little pathways that you have to kind of carve out just so you have places to stand. And then maybe you can plant above or and below those paths. If you can, you know, creating some, you know, terraces like you saw in the front yard that we were working with that are at least 2 or 3 feet wide, create, you know, planting areas that are flat. That means though that you have a very steep area that you've created. It was a slope, and then you've cut into to make a flat, and then you have to have a very steep place, and that's where the rock facing or whatever comes from, some kind of retaining. Be careful when you're getting into retaining walls above a foot or 2. You need some engineering. But so terracing would be an initial technique or strategy. Otherwise, your mulch is going to be sliding down the hill. It becomes tricky. You can do it. So I would just orient everything on the contour, even if you're not terracing. Your paths, your mulch, your rows, whatever it is, as much as you can, put it on the contour, flat or level, as much as possible. The other thing I think about the particular aspect you're talking about, facing southwest or west, is that that's the hot afternoon sun, isn't it? So north is cool, east has that beautiful morning sun, south is warm, but southwest and west is that late afternoon summer sun on those long days at 2 or 3 o'clock. Like, you know, it's going to be warm, I think, next week again. That's when it really heats up. So you need plants that are adapted to that. So think of the desert. Think of Mediterranean plants. Think of figs, grapes, pomegranates, Opuntia cactus, jujube. These are all desert plants. And these are plants that are going to love that heat. Think of growing a watermelon out there, you know. Think about growing, you know, things that love that kind of heat. Think about goji berries. Think about, you know, all that desert stuff. And if you're going to grow anything over there, make sure it can stand that heat and full sun. Otherwise, get it around to that east side or somewhere else, even if it's part sun. That late afternoon sun can be brutal. It's a nice, if you can get some shade over there, even with a trellis or fence or something, sometimes that's helpful to get things established. But use lots of mulch. Mulch will be very important too over on that side. And if you're in a cooler area, maybe you want that heat. Maybe you're near the coast and that west-facing side is someplace that you just want to crank up that heat. So you're actually making it more hot by piling up rocks and, you know, reflective surfaces and all that kind of stuff. So depends on your situation where you're located, but those are some of the ideas with your microclimate adaptation and enhancement.
Sort of a related question on the other side of that. Any suggestions for those who might get some morning sun, but then everything's in shade in the afternoons?
Great. So in that case, you have a really gentle morning sun where the temperatures are cool and you get full sun, but the morning temperatures are still cool. And so that means that a lot of plants can be grown there. But heat-loving ones won't thrive as much. So I'm thinking on that morning side, you would be growing lots of berries. You'd be growing lots of greens. You'd be growing lots of root crops. And so they could stand the half-day sun in the morning, and then the afternoon heat they're protected from. So those would be some of the kinds of plants that I would be considering for that morning sun. Things that are from places that are used to more humid conditions, plants that are more, you know, like things from back east and stuff I'm thinking of, but or from jolly old England, you know, that, you know, the tender little primroses and, you know, this and that, if you're going to do some ornamentals. But yeah, the greens, the roots, and the berries, I'd get to the morning sun.
There have been some questions on resources for learning more on capturing rainwater, roof water, swales. I will use the minute to plug sustainablesolano.org. We have a bunch of resources on our website. We're actually developing some additional videos and these sorts of this sort of online material to try to help with that while we can't do our in-person workshops. And once we're back to doing in-person workshops, you can actually come out and help us dig a swale. So, but John, if you have some resources you would like to mention that you found really valuable there.
Well, yeah, in fact, there's two particular women that I wanted to mention around the water. And that's Christina Bertea. And she's worked a lot with the Greywater Action folks there in the East Bay. And then down in the Santa Cruz area, I want to mention Lydia Nelson. And these women are just incredible working with water in all its different forms, both gray water and rainfall and all the whole thing. So looking them up and contacting them individually, but the Greywater Action, Brad Lancaster stuff that I mentioned in the slideshow are great resources. And yeah, there's in your local communities, you can find the governments now are getting turned on to this. It's cheaper to help people save water with these kinds of landscapes than it is to create more water supply. So you'll find in many municipalities here in Petaluma, Daily Axe has been doing these laundry to landscape things, and the city's all behind it. They'll even give you mulch and chips and plants, and it's great. So I know people are coming from all over. We have a big audience here today. It's not just Bay Area folks. I saw somebody was from Ontario, Canada. So I just wanted to say, rain gardens in that part of the world are very important. You have summer rains in those areas. And so creating basins and swales to infiltrate that water in the summertime can create wonderful habitat. And it's a great way to reduce runoff and create more habitat in your yard. And even maybe some fruit trees might be part of that too. So yes, those are some of my favorite resources. And I also have my 5 little tidbits on what you can do right now before we close or in some transition, because I know we're approaching the end of our little time here, but I'm willing to go on a little bit longer. So however you guys want to manage it there.
Yeah, I think if folks are able to stay on for a few more minutes, we'd love to get these questions that have come up answered. To the point of Lydia, we'll actually have an upcoming video from her to share. And we've been in conversation with her about our permaculture design course. So yeah, all great contacts. There was a question about how can I get rid of that common fennel? So what would you suggest for fennel that's coming up?
Sure. Well, right now they're at a really, this is an important thing for me, is just getting to know the wild plants in your area that no one planted. Maybe they're even considered bothersome, like the fennel, the wild fennel. So number one thing I would do is study fennel. Get to know what you're in there, and so fennel, how do you use fennel? What is it good for? How can I use it? Right now it's very lush and it's in its vegetative form, so it's a great time to harvest it. You could dry it, you could use it for garnishes. I mean, you could cook with it, all these things. Before it gets woody, once it gets that stem, it's going to start to flower, and then the flowers are a whole nother stage. Really good for beneficial insects. Okay, I'm going to get to the bad parts of it soon. But the flowers are great for beneficial insects. They feed a lot of, you can see lots of insects taking advantage of the pollen and nectar. And that pollen, it's really hard to collect, but that is a garnish that is so, I've seen chefs, sprinkle that on a salad or whatever. And it's like a whole thing, the fennel pollen or the small flowers. You can just eat those as they are. The seeds themselves, okay, the green seeds, you can eat them, the dried seeds, but the problem is when those dried seeds get spread around by birds and keep on raining down by the millions, that's part of the problem, is the continued source of seeds. So if you can go out there and make use of this plant, is what I'm suggesting, as part of its eradication program. So in your area, if you have woody ones, keeping it cut back constantly, either by mowing, grazing, harvesting, whatever, and certainly not letting it flower. So that would be a minimal. Don't let it seed, don't let it flower, keep the leaves off of it. It's going to eventually give it up. Digging it out is going to be problematic. You can cut it back and cover it up, maybe with some cardboard. It'll try to poke up through, but keeping it smothered for several months can work. Sometimes we'll use a tarp or a weed mat and tack down in certain areas temporarily. Once it dies back, we peel it off. It's like an alternative to tillage, basically, or digging them up. You can dig them up. They're pretty hard, if you're going to dig them up now before it dries out. Because once it dries out, it's going to be even harder to do. So if you're going to try to dig them out, try now. Otherwise, keep harvesting. Get some animals on it. You got it. You know, you have some. This is where you have the pet goat. You know, stick it out there. But yes, so, and every plant's like that. There's some important use for it that maybe you could help pay for its eradication, basically.
So John, I know you came today with some tips for what people can take and outside today and put to use in their yards. So do you want to tell us about that now?
Sure. Just a few quickies. You know, I know that people have all different levels of experience here. And I thank you so much for joining us and being part of the discussion. And like I said, I'd be willing to hang around if others are after we close here. But 5 things I wanted to give you real quick that I thought anybody could get started on, whatever your level is. Number 1 is I just want to make sure that no one's putting the food waste into the landfill. That is so wrong. Right now, maybe we bought a little too much food because we didn't know how much food access we'd have. We have some food waste. We all have it. It's okay. So just make sure it gets put back into the soil. So make sure you're into composting, or at least get a little worm bin going. Just shredded newspapers, food scraps, a handful of worms, you're off. You're doing it. So just make sure that your food waste is going to where it needs to go. Number 2, get to know those weeds. It was great that final question on the fennel. Get to know your nearby wild plants, known as weeds, and figure out how they're usable for food, medicine, fodder, fertility, at least compost them. But I'm thinking things like, you know, right now I'm looking at beautiful miner's lettuce, or I like to call it Indian lettuce, the Claytonia, the chickweed. I'm looking at dandelions. I'm looking at so many little edible herbs and plants right now that are just waiting for you out there that you didn't have to plant. Getting to know those cycles is your first harvest, really. Before also start growing something yourself, seeding things. Grow some sprouts. In 2 or 3 days, you're rinsing some seeds and they transform from a little dead seed, not dead, but a little dormant seed that has a certain amount of nutrition. You increase the nutrition 10 times. And, you know, so just by soaking and sprouting things, try some trade greens, some sunflower greens, or some buckwheat greens or pea greens. Plant a flat very densely, grow them up about 6 to 8 inches tall, harvest them in 10 days. It's so easy. And then you can get into your more advanced things. And then 2 more. You can go to your market right now, wherever, you know, produce market, farmer's market, whatever. We have little Asian groceries around here that we like to go to and look at and see how you can start plants from the produce itself. Somebody mentioned sweet potatoes. Get your favorite sweet potato, set it half deep in the soil and let the sprouts come up. Just bend off those sprouts at the base. They might even have a couple little roots coming off of them next to the sweet potato. Once they've sprouted about 6 inches, bend those off and plant them, and you're growing your own sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are great if you're in a warm area. What other things? You can plant a whole chayote. You know, the chayote squash, great perennial vegetable. Plant the whole fruit half deep. A vine will come up, and in September, you'll have a bunch of fruits. And herbs, little bunches of herbs. So easy to just take those little cuttings and put them in soil. They'll root up. It's, you know, mince, thyme, little, you know, oreganos. All these things are super easy to start by little, you know, produce, things that you get in the store or in the farmer's market. And lastly, I'm a fruit tree guy. I got to say, get out there and start thinning your fruit, everybody. Those little fruits, there's too many of them. You got to get rid, you got to take off like 90% of them. You want those fruits about 6 inches apart, right? Get them about 6 inches apart. Then your tree won't break branches, and you will have not, you know, too much one year, not enough the next. And also consider some summer pruning, because all those shoots from that winter pruning you did, all those shoots are going to jump up 5-10 feet. So get out there in the summertime and nip them back and get them to branch out more, or eliminate the ones you don't want. Do summer pruning for size control and to open your trees up to light. Don't just winter prune. So a few quickies for you guys. Thanks so much, you know, Sustainable Solano and all you participants. Like I said, I'd be willing to hang around and talk a little bit longer if you guys want to. I have, next half an hour open or whatever you guys want to do. It's up to you guys. So thanks again so much for having me. And I hope, a little tour around the world and a tour of this beautiful little Benicia living, learning garden, got you guys turned on, and you guys, you all can do this in your own communities at home. So thanks again so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, John and Allison, this was great. Just a few shout outs is that we are planning on having a regrow from your vegetable scraps class. I'm connecting with someone about that, so that's in the works. We plan to do another tour of the Vallejo Gardens, similar to this, but Lydia's gonna do it, Lydia Nielsen, which has been mentioned multiple times, and she's gonna do her talk on Rehydrate the Earth, so that's wonderful. Hope you guys can join us. We also have today only, I don't know if you can see it, can everyone see this? Grow a Pear Nursery in Vallejo, great name. If you live locally, they're given 10% off today. I will go into the chat, and unless Allison, if you can do that, send a link to Grow a Pear Nursery so people, but it's for today only. And then just in closing, I wanna just reflect on one question. Like, what do you have excess in your life? What do you have? Do you have time, money, seeds, fruit, toilet paper? I invite you to just find ways to pass on that excess. Maybe make a May Day basket for your neighbors and leave it on their doorstep, or just practice being radically kind in your thoughts and actions. And yes, take good care. So thank you all. And John, if you are available to answer some questions, I know we still have some. I just wanted to close out for everybody that is on a time schedule today. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you all so much. Feel free to drop off if you need to head somewhere. There were a few more questions that came in, John, so I'm gonna have to scroll back up if you guys will be patient with me.
Sure.
So one question, my Asian plum broke due to heavy fruits and wind blown. Will it survive? Some branches are still okay.
Yes. Let me just start off with this idea that I think it was maybe Masunobu Fukuoka talked about the do nothing gardening. And us permaculture folks are really, we like that idea, do nothing gardening. So I'm really into the self-seeding vegetables, things that you let flower, good for the beneficial insects, they self-seed, go back and everything. And self-seeding vegetables, great. They become vegetable weeds like, arugula and kale and chard and all these things. So, but with the trees, it's like, oh yeah, well, pruning, it's so unnatural, just let the trees have their natural form. Now, if these trees were wild trees, I think that that's an interesting thing to study, how a wild tree grows. But you have to remember, wild trees, unless you're in the tropics, have very small fruits, and they know how to handle their loads properly. What we have done is we have domesticated trees, just like we've domesticated animals. We have taught animals that, hey, if you hang around here, I'll feed you, and you can get so big that you won't even be able to defend yourself. You won't be able to run away. You'll just be, so big, So what permaculture we do is we play between wild and domesticated. We go back and forth. We try to make wild things more domesticated and domesticated things more wild. So in the sense of fruit trees, especially, we have bred them like wild pears are these little things, little gravelly things on a thorny tree. But we want a nice, big, beautiful pear, right? We want a big pear. And when a plum, a pear, whatever, apple, peach, when those trees load up, they are waiting for us to care for them. We taught them and trained them to produce more and more and more, bigger and bigger, bigger, sweeter and sweeter. And what? We're not going to make sure that they don't hurt themselves? No, fruit thinning is essential, and do it right now, especially when they're like pea to marble size is kind of ideal. Sometimes you just do it real fast and just leave some. Sometimes you're out there with little, your little fine pointed snips, and you're cutting and you're choosing the best one, and you're cutting out all the ones around it that you don't want, and it's very delicate, and you only have 1 or 2 trees, you can do that. If you have a bunch of trees, you're more like kind of running through it quickly, and it's okay. There is a thing called June drop that happens, and birds can eat some fruits, and you know, don't thin them all out. But especially for young trees, I would take all the fruit off until they get strong enough to really hold a fruit load. Because once they start bearing fruit, they tend to grow less, especially a young tree. So about your specific tree that already loaded up and broke branches, what you want to do is make sure that whatever branches broke, if they're still hanging or there's a big ripped off part, that you clean up that wound. So where it tore off, make sure that it's a smooth edge for it to heal around and over. So it can get smaller and smaller over time, and the tree can, you know, every year it'll grow a little bit more and close and close and close that wound. If it's jagged and there's something hanging out, it's difficult for it to completely heal over. So clean up that torn area, and also understand the structure of the tree. There maybe have been other reasons for it to have been weak. Not only the fruit load, but especially if our branches are too narrow. So we like to have branches have about a 45-degree angle. 45 to 60 is kind of good. 90 is not that strong of a branch angle, but about 60 to 45 is good. If we have less than 45 degrees in a branch angle, what can happen is we can get bark that's trapped in between those two branches as they can increase in diameter. And that trapped bark creates a very weak union there where this branch can split out really easily. If they're 45 degrees or more apart, they can increase in diameter and not get that bark trapped in. So make sure, especially in a young tree, that those branches have good open branch crotches. If you have too many thin branches like this, maybe eliminate the middle one to give you a nice open branching. That is a stronger branch. So there's a few things to consider in the ability of your tree to hold fruit. Thin it, but also another technique is branch supports. Maybe you've seen that, like we have out here in our orchards in Sebastopol here. When the trees are really loaded up and they have horizontal branches, we'll stick 2x2 or even 4x4 sticks or posts under the branch to support that heavy, you know, here's a branch full of fruit, and I'm going to put a little support, like if you can see this tree behind me, put that little support under that horizontal branch there so it can bear more fruit and not snap off. So those are a few techniques. Thinning, making sure it can heal over properly, making sure you have good branch angles, and then you can also support branches with props.
So just a reminder, if anyone wants to raise their hand, so you can ask your specific question, and that way, if you have any follow-up questions, that would be great. Since we're discussing fruit trees, there was a question about pruning an apple tree. It says they are going wild. So should they be pruned?
Yeah, well, I wanted to also shout out some folks. I'm seeing some folks from Fresno. There were some folks from I just want to acknowledge these people from all over the U.S. that are coming in on this. I'm really happy to have you all. And it's a little different for everywhere, but we're talking about pruning trees. And again, like we're saying, these are domesticated trees. I want you to get into a balanced pruning program that isn't just winter pruning. So you have to understand that winter pruning, especially with deciduous trees like an apple, where the trees lose all their leaves and go dormant in the winter, they have stored all their energy in the bark of the tree, and they're getting ready to regrow in the spring. And so if you only prune them when they're completely dormant, they're going to regrow like crazy. Like if you were going to, like, it happens. Trees get cut down and they try to regrow. If it happens in the winter, the tree regrows. It can grow a whole new tree almost in one season if you cut it down to the ground. So when you're doing heavy pruning on your winter pruning, you're actually stimulating growth. And in a young tree, that's great because you want the young tree to fill the space, we say. You know, we want to get that tree up to a height we want. No taller than we can reach typically, unless you want to be climbing trees or up in ladders. That's great too. But most of my clients, I say, hey, let's just keep this tree where you can reach it from the ground. And so that means that you let it fill up that space by pruning it early at knee height. When it's a whip of a tree, first year, knee height branching, it gets 3 branches at knee height. Then at waist height, you cut it off again. And each one of those becomes 3 more. And so by the time it's shoulder height, we've cut it 3 or 4. We have about 30 branches now that's about head high, and we keep it there. So that's one strategy, is to start the branching low and keep your tree low to begin with. Then that's winter pruning to stimulate that growth. But the summer, you're going to see these long shoots come out. That's when you want to start managing those summer shoots by, there's only basically 2 pruning techniques we use. One is called thinning, where you completely eliminate a branch by removing it at the base where it comes from. So if I have a tree like this, a thinning cut would be to remove it at the base here. Well, I'll do it this way because I don't want to flip you off. Here's the branching, and a thinning cut would be to remove this completely at the base. I'd cut it right here, and then I just have the one. The other cut is called a heading cut, and that's when we have a branch where we cut it in the middle. And when we cut that branch in the middle, there's a bunch of hidden buds where every leaf was, or is if it's summertime. There's a potential for it to branch out. So a heading cut is taking the tip off, and then it usually makes 3 branches, 3 or 4, 2 to 4 branches when you cut a branch in the middle like that heading cut. So what we do a lot of in the summer is when we have our winter cuts reacting with all these shoots coming out that are getting 4 or 5 feet long, we'll do a bunch of thinning cuts to where the branches are evenly spaced apart. And then we'll do a heading cut to make each one branch out. That combination of summer pruning, where we're thinning and eliminating too many branches that are close together, and then tipping back or heading back each of those to make them branch out, gives you a stout, strong tree that's lower and able to hold more fruit. It actually stimulates that lower part to make more fruiting spurs, little branches that make fruit on apple trees in particular. So those are a couple strategies. There's some fruit trees we don't prune in the winter months because, even though they're deciduous, because it kind of spreads disease, especially cherries and apricots, we don't prune. This year I've seen a lot of disease in plums, a lot of disease in apples. I tend not to spray. I use a lot of neem, maybe, neem oil I love to prevent disease. But be careful around that with bees. Don't spray it when there's bees out. Neem and bees don't get together. Don't get along. So yeah, apple trees. Another thing, there's something called size controlling rootstock. If you're planting a new tree and you're in a really rich vegetable garden, you want to keep it small, think about a dwarfing rootstock. And those dwarfing rootstocks can help calm your tree down. They stump the tree a little bit. Don't use them in a rough backyard that's got bad soil. Do not use a dwarfing rootstock in there. Use a regular like 111 or something, because it's going to need all the help it can get if it's a rough situation. So a few thoughts there on pruning apples.
All right, so I think we've got about 3 more questions, if that works for you, John.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so since we were just talking about grafting, someone was asking what to do when part of a grafted tree dies.
Yeah. I saw there too is an Asian plum that broke. Yeah, pears can break, plums can break. It's all the same, basically, what I mentioned about the breaking branches. But and then I'm sorry, one more time. Repeat the question.
Apologies. What to do if part of a grafted tree dies?
So if it's a multi-grafted tree, which is I think maybe what you're talking about, where it has several different varieties grafted onto one tree, that is a fancy trick that we do. We can do that for better cross-pollination to spread out your harvest, so you have early, middle, late season. But what happens is sometimes, depending on how it's grafted, and there's different vigor for each variety. So depending on where it's grafted on the tree, if it's a higher graft, often they'll take over, or if it's a particularly vigorous variety, like for us here, we have the Santa Rosa Plum, it wants to take over. Or you have a particular pluot, it will just want to take over, and something a little bit slower gets smothered. So balancing the growth on a multi-grafted fruit tree is really important. Keep everybody kind of balanced. You don't want anybody to start taking over, because that causes this apical dominance where the things growing on top smother everything else and tell everything else to be quiet. So keep everything balanced. But if you have a graft that dies, you should just be able to cut off the dead part, and you'll still have the other varieties there. If you have the complete top of the fruit tree die for whatever reason, and you only have the rootstock there, and this also happens just on regular citrus trees, where the rootstock will just take over. Like you'll have a little thorny sucker come up, and then it just kind of pokes through the middle, and then before you know it, it's a 10-foot shoot with 3-inch long spines and weird fruit that you've never seen before. That's your rootstock taking over. So be that as it may, whether the top died or if it's still there, your rootstock should still be alive. If your rootstock's still alive, make sure there's no little pieces of graft that are still alive there. Cut away the rootstock you don't want, and see if there's any bit of that graft left that you can retain. If not, you might have to learn grafting, and we can teach you how to do that. Basically, you open up the bark and you can slide a variety in there, and it'll grow a whole new tree again. And so that's what we're doing a lot now. I'm still doing grafting of deciduous things now. We graft pretty much year round, but now is the summer, and as it warms up in this warm spring months is when we start doing citrus grafts. And so we usually order away from those from a special place where they're disease-free and everything. But when you have a graft that dies back, try to understand what is still alive on that. Is it above the graft or below? Do you have any of that cultivar, the fruiting part of it, still alive? Or is it just rootstock now? Then you can decide what you want to do with the rootstock that's trying to sprout back, maybe if you're going to eliminate it all and still cultivate that little piece of your fruiting part, or you want to just start working with that rootstock, cut off the old dead part, and think about how you're going to use this rootstock to graft into it something that you want.
So, John, I know I said a couple of questions, but this one's related, and I will try to make these quick. As I mentioned in the chat too, if there are additional questions, you can email them to me afterward. We'll try to make sure we get them answered one way or the other. But there is a couple more grafting questions. So one person's asking if you can buy the scions. Where do you find those? Where do you get those? And someone's asking, can we still graft fruit trees right now, like a pomegranate?
Thank you. Well, yes. Like I mentioned just now, you can graft year-round. There are grafting techniques that we use year-round. My favorite time of the year is now, say from February into June. It's really when the deciduous trees are waking up. You know, that warm weather, things are opening up and starting to grow. I really like to catch that wave of growth when I'm putting the new little plants together. They heal faster and they grow right away. They're not going to be sitting around maybe getting rained on or frosted or in the hot sun or something too long. They're going to be healing and growing quickly. So how to learn about grafting. Be careful out on the internet. There's some grafting there's a bunch of grafting, you know, videos and stuff on the internet. I don't recommend them all. One website I do like, and it focuses on citrus mostly. It's called fruitmentor.com. I know the guy, he's a great guy, and he's really into helping spread the word about how to propagate citrus safely by using budwood from the Citrus Clonal Protection Program that cultivates 250 varieties of citrus, guaranteed to be disease-free. And this is the only legal way to get this stuff. You can order it online, Citrus Clonal Protection Program. And for citrus, for other types of budwood or grafting material, we call them scions. They're sticks, you know, maybe 6 or 9 inches long, usually dormant In the case of citrus trees, they're always got leaves on them, so they have to be used right away, like within a couple of weeks of you receiving them from the mail order place like this. But the deciduous trees, because they're dormant in the winter, you can keep them in the refrigerator. You can harvest them dormant with no leaves. And this is just the tip of the branches, not the old wood that is made fruit and stuff, but the very tip of the branches, the terminal buds we're talking about. Those can be put into a Ziploc bag with a little bit of moisture and kept for months. I have stuff in the refrigerator I harvested in December. That's 4 months ago. I'll still be grafting in June with that same material because it stores so well, especially things like pears and apples and plums. They store really well, and you can use them later. Where to get them? I'm active with the California Rare Fruit Growers. Check them out. crfg.org. There's probably local chapters all throughout California for you California folks. If you're back east or in Canada or other parts of the country, North America or beyond, look for your local fruit enthusiast groups. There's North American Fruit Explorers. There's up in the Pacific Northwest, if you're up in Seattle, in Portland, there's, oh gosh, I'm forgetting their names. There's a Fruit Home Orchard Society in Portland. It just came to me. There's the Western Washington Fruit Growers. You know, so there are regional fruit growing groups, and they get together and teach grafting, usually in the winter months. But right now is when we're doing the budding, when the bark is slipping. I'm doing a lot of top working where I'm cutting trees off this big around and slipping it into the bark right now. There's all these different techniques you can use. Right now is a great time to be doing a lot of, I'm going to start doing my pawpaws now for you back east folks. I'm doing nut trees now. They like this warm, you know, they like to heal real fast in this warm weather. So, but basically you just need a sharp knife. You don't need fancy tools. It could be a snap knife, you know, a razor knife, and some masking tape. And that's about it. And some budwood. Oh yes. Where to get it? Let me continue on some sources. There's one place up here in Orleans, in Humboldt, in Trinity County up there, in Northern California, called the Fruitwood Nursery. And Mark and Karina up there have one of the best collections of fruit trees in the West Coast. Oh my gosh. They sold their nursery, Rolling River Nursery, they sold it to Planting Justice, that works with formerly incarcerated people here in Oakland. And that's a great nursery for plants to begin with. If you need good plants, go check out Rolling River Nursery. I mean, yeah, that's Planting Justice. But the Fruitwood Nursery, check them out. They have an amazing collection. They have a great, you can order online. See, with the California Rare Fruit Growers, every year we have a big sign exchange in January. I don't know how it's going to be next year with all the social distancing, but we have all the little packages of wood. We had hundreds of varieties of fruit trees available as in the form of little sticks that we share with people for very little to enter. And then we have grafting classes at these events throughout the month of January in Northern California, and they do it in Southern California too. So get out there and learn who's teaching grafting. Might be cooperative extension folks, but the sources of material, there's even an online scion trading discussion group. Oh, I guess it's a Facebook. That's why I'm not doing Facebook, so I haven't been interacting with it that much. But if you guys are on Facebook, check out that sign exchange Facebook page. They're trading sticks from all over the US. Just be careful. Don't share diseases and don't share pests through that process. Be careful. Be responsible. Just like with the pandemic here, you know, we have to practice safe plant sharing, just like we're doing our social distancing. And so be careful with that stuff. But that's another great resource for you Facebook folks that are out there. And let me recommend, there's a bunch of books that I would recommend, a lot of good recent books, but the classic is called The Grafter's Handbook by R.J. Garner. That's it. That's the original from the 40s, been updated for the last 50 years, every few years. If you can get a hold of a used copy of that, it has all the nice hand-drawn drawings of all the different ways you can match up the cambium. It's all about the cambial contact, that living tissue of the wood lined up, and then they heal together and you have a whole new tree. So that's what it's all about.
Great. So there's a question about a volunteer fig. It says, have a volunteer fig they've kept it hoping it would yield fruit and shade. It yields both, but the figs are inedible. Any
Yes.
suggestions?
Right. So figs, if you really want to go down a botanical rabbit hole, a pomological rabbit hole, look into the sex life of a fig tree. It's very complicated. And you need to know the sex life of your fruit trees so you know if they're going to bear fruit or not. Many fruit trees are self-fertile, which we love. And all those Mediterranean ones I mentioned, figs, grapes, pomegranates, are all self-fertile. One tree, no problem. There's some others like persimmons. What's another one? Guavas. There's a bunch of trees that are citrus, most all citrus. One tree, self-fertile. There's some things that need cross-pollination. They're self-infertile. They can't pollinize themselves. So they need a friend that's a completely different variety that can cross-pollinate. So they can pollinate them and vice versa. They exchange pollen that way. So, and then there's some that are completely separate, male and female, like a kiwi, for example, or a pistachio. For those of you who are in a real hot area, like in the Central Valley, you can grow pistachios. You have a male tree and a female tree, separate trees altogether. You could do a multigraph. But so knowing all this is important to understand where you're going with things. And I've already forgotten the question. I got into the fig. Fig sex. Oh, that's like a whole nother level. So they have, some things are wind pollinated, but a lot of trees have adapted to feed pollen and nectar. Nectar is basically the bait for the insects to come and spread the pollen around, right? And the fruits are the bait for us and other creatures to spread the seeds around. So in the case of figs, there's a wasp and it gets encased in there, and it's a whole complicated thing on some of them, but most of the figs we grow are called common figs that don't need that complicated wasp pollination process. So what you have is a seedling fig, and seedlings, some seedlings are true to type more than others. Apricots and peaches, fairly true to type. Citrus, pretty good. Peaches, pretty good. But many other trees will be totally different varieties that aren't that good. In the case of figs, 1 out of 100, I don't know, are going to be worth eating. And what you might have, you might actually have a male tree. This is a tree that doesn't make edible fruit. It only makes pollen that wasp would take to the female. And so it's kind of a useless mostly, unless you're in a place that has the Adriatic figs that need the special fig and the wasp and everything. But mostly what I would think of is figs are so easy to start by cutting. I would just think of getting a piece of my friend's, a really good bearing fig tree that bears well in your area. Get a piece of it. You can trade them online like we were talking about. They start up really easy by cutting. Otherwise, you can learn grafting, and you can graft a variety onto that rootstock because it's got such a big rootstock. You could have a really big fig tree really fast. So that's another option. I would consider grafting onto that tree, stumping it off and figuring out how to get some sticks under the bark there, wrap it all up, or replace it with a known cultivar that's worth. I have found seedling fig trees that were incredible. I have one that I'm calling Black Manzanita. I found it next to the water down in Richardson's Bay and near Sausalito down there. Incredible fig. So you can find them, but I guess not that one.
So last 2 questions, because I know we're trying to get you finished by 12:30 here. One person is asking about leaf curl, peach curl, ways to either control or prevent. And then I thought maybe we could finish with someone's got a volunteer white oak, and they're wondering about what are some good gilt plants to think about around that.
Yes. So the white oak is it's a big decision. So So oak trees can get very large. So depending on what your eventual plan is, I mean, you can keep an oak tree small for a while. You're going to have to be pruning it regularly, and it's going to eventually want to get to its big white oak size. So unless it's in a wild area, I would be careful. I might relocate it to a margin, especially a north side. Because it's a deciduous tree, it's wonderful that it lets light in the winter. So there could be some things under it that like some winter light. I would be careful with planting under oak trees, though. I'd be careful because you can kill an oak tree with irrigation, with excessive irrigation. There, you know, our big valley oaks can stand some water, but their crowns certainly shouldn't be in a low spot to where they're going to get wet. And people irrigating too much in the summer can weaken an oak tree. So I would be really looking at native plants, looking at what kinds of trees are living within the oaks in your area. So in my area, there's a whole variety of, there's a couple of other oak trees like black oaks and, you know, live oaks. There's a variety of shrubs that do well on the edge of oak trees like that. You know, these are shrubs like our toyon, manzanita, needs a little more full sun, but toyon can take some shade. Ceanothus, you know, coffee berry bushes, those all can take some marginal shade like that. And then I mentioned all the berry plants, you know, we have, you know, our huckleberries are usually more in coniferous, but, you know, you could get by with some of those maybe, but certainly blackberries and some other berries might go under there. But I would be careful overwatering under an oak tree. As a guild, you know, I do, you know, maybe a companion black walnut. And what else would I do? Yeah, just my favorite natives. Yeah, it depends on where you're at. You know, just because a tree shows up in your place doesn't mean necessarily it's from there or you want it there. So I would at least pot it up and make sure it gets to a good home if you decide it's not appropriate for where it's at. But and then the first question again, could you repeat it? Sorry.
Of course. Ways to control or prevent peach curl.
Oh yeah. I'm a laissez-faire kind of no spray kind of guy as much as possible, but I'm trained in pesticide application and all that, organic pesticide application. I've been an organic farm inspector and all that kind of stuff. And my conclusion is that peach leaf curl, if your peach tree or your nectarine tree is healthy, it should be able to grow out of that condition and replace all those leaves with new leaves once the rains stop, which they may have stopped. We might get maybe 1 or 2 more little rains coming up here. May is usually the transition months here in California. For all you other folks that don't understand, California, it stops raining like in a few weeks here, and we won't see another drop of rain until October. That's our summers. So that's why we grow such good, easy, you know, we have fewer diseases and pests because of our dry summers. So what I'm saying is once that stops, the leaves can come out fresh and they'll be pretty good. If the tree is healthy, has enough water, has good soil, all these things. If your tree is stressed at all, it may weaken the tree and it can affect the fruit eventually if it's not a healthy tree to begin with. So I tend to not do anything and just wait for all those leaves to drop and they grow new ones. If your tree is declining, there may be other issues. Is it getting enough water? Too much water, not enough water, fertility, over fertilizing, not enough fertilizing. You have all the, you know, beneficial insects around, all these things. So I would assess all that and then decide whether, if you want to use a spray, you know, I've heard of compost tea. That's lovely. If it works for you, great. I haven't seen it prevent. Oh, let me just say this about the disease to begin with. It's a fungal disease. I've seen it show up in years with heavy rains. No problem, nothing. I've seen drier years when it just ruined trees, it seemed. So I'm saying even with doing nothing, it can be so variable. Now I've applied compost tea, I've applied neem, I've applied, you know, aerated compost tea, good compost tea. I've applied neem, I've applied stronger things like lime sulfur. I've applied even sometimes copper compounds, you know, which I think if you use them every year can be toxic, but maybe once every few years maybe isn't so bad. But in every one of those, I've found some years terrible and some years great. So I can't say that any of those methods are any more dependable than the other. So go with what feels good for you. Ignore it. Do some compost tea, because compost tea is great anyway. If you want to get into tougher stuff, just make sure you follow the label directions. If you go to a store and get some chemical, you know, even if it's certified for organic use, read the label, wear the protective clothing, use the interval, dilute it properly, spray it when it says to, do all the things it says. Otherwise, you're polluting the place and it may not be as effective. So that's my recommendation. Peach leaf curl. Just keep your tree healthy, and I bet you'll grow out of it pretty good. I find nectarines a little bit more touchy with stuff, but we love nectarines so much, we just, you know, put up with it. So those are some those are some comments on the curl for you guys.
Well, thank you so much, John. I have peach curl issues, so I was paying attention to that one.
I'm sorry. It's emotional. I know people love their trees, and when they see the tree so curled up and puckered, it looks painful. Oh my God, it's suffering. And you know, there is something to that. And if you're patient, I've had people literally pick off every damaged leaf. You can do that if it makes you feel better. Take care of your tree, and just know that it's going to grow some new leaves. And so give it that more, you know, whatever you need to do to assuage yourself, because I know some people, it just drives them crazy. They're just like, ah. So
well,
take care of your tree, take care of yourself.
Thank you so much. And that's a good note to leave on, is take care of your tree, right?
Taking care of you, we'll take care of each other.
Take care of each other. Thank you all so much. I think this is a close. Bye. Thank you so much. Thanks, John, everybody. I see familiar faces and new ones.